Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Ask and Wonder, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together to talk about the big questions in life. And today we have an interesting topic, and it's a topic that usually comes up in conversation when Christians and non-Christians have conversations, which is Jesus among other gods. You know, talking about exclusivism and tolerance and the typical question, the way we hear it is, if there are many religions in the world, why should we pick Christianity and in particular Jesus? And for this conversation, I'm very excited to have here a friend and Christian apologist, Jonathan Martinez. How are you, Jonathan?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. So before we start the conversation, just as you guys know, in the description of the video, you'll see ways to connect with Ask and Wonder. You can send an email to me at askandwondernashville@gmail.com. And you can also go to the website, askandwonder.com. And you can send an email to me. You can ask me any questions you want. And also know that this episode, you're watching it on YouTube, but it's also going to be an episode on the podcast. And you can find this episode on iTunes, and you just go to the search bar and you can just type Ask and Wonder and you'll see it there. Okay. Well, Jonathan, I'll start always with the same question with all my guests. We know now that you're a Christian, but my question is, could you tell us a little bit about your journey to Christianity? Have you always been a Christian, or in the past you weren't?
Well, I would say, I wasn't born a Christian, but I was brought up in a Christian home. My grandfather was a pastor, and I grew up every Sunday and with my family throughout the week, not just attending, but being very involved. And my grandfather became ill when I was about 12 years old, and so he wasn't able to physically minister anymore. And so it was at about this age, 12 or 13, when I wasn't necessarily immediately in church as much or involved with the community as much, that I really began to have a lot of questions. Not necessarily doubts, but very many questions. Questions that I think just about everyone has about life. And I I began to seek these answers for these questions, and I had a particular open-mindedness uh, to whatever would be available, but in particular to a Christian worldview. And with time, I found that the Lord was very giving and generous in answers that I was finding and being shared with, and not so much that I was intelligent to understand things, but that I was very much so graciously blessed with people who would share them with me. And my journey really began to take off there in terms of really discovering the Lord, my own personal relationship, and really seeking out answers to a lot of different questions.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing that. And what about Jonathan? Uh, about today's question, Jesus among other gods. How often do you find yourself talking about this topic with friends and other non-believers?
I don't necessarily know in frequency how to gauge it in terms of how often, but
Uh-huh.
I think it comes up more daily than people may think,
Mm,
and I think I'm more aware of it because of the time that I spend learning and reading and listening and having intentionally these conversations. But I would say the conversation comes up in different ways,
mm,
and in many ways, I think they're indirect. When someone shares with me what they may be going through in their life, and they themselves may pose a question, such as, for example, I was speaking with someone the other day, and they had an illness that they had very small odds of experiencing uh,
oh,
expectancy, and they came through. And I asked them, did you ever think, why am I still here? And he began to share. And these kinds of conversations just come up throughout the day. And I was just at work. But I think that they happen more often than we may be aware of. But I,
mm,
I think if we're looking for them, definitely we'll see them. But I think they're definitely there.
mm. So this topic, of course, it's difficult to talk about this topic without defining terms, and one of them that comes up a lot is the topic of exclusivism.
Mhm.
And, for example, in the Bible, in John 14:6, we have, the verse of with Jesus saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life.
Mhm.
So it seems no one comes to the Father except through me. And that sounds, direct, concise, and simple at the same time. Seems difficult to understand for many people. Why do you think that's, well, actually, before I go there, so why don't you help me and help us understand more about exclusivism? What is that and what it does in worldviews?
Well, I think to begin, I think that we can have the starting point to understand that each person has a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Many people may not consider themselves to be religious, but each person does have a worldview,
Mm-hmm.
and to better understand what a worldview is, it's the lens through which we view life.
Mm.
It's the lens in which we approach the different questions that come up in life, and not just the big ones, but even the small ones, the details. And so, understanding that each person does have a worldview, uh, the next the next following question is, well, what is the worldview? How did you arrive here? And questions as such arise. But when it comes to exclusivity, I, I know that it can come off perhaps as a harsh connotation that you, by definition, exclude someone or something. But I believe that when one is truly seeking truth, they will find that truth in its very nature, in its in its definition, is exclusive itself.
Mm-hmm.
The logical understanding of what truth is proposes that in itself is exclusive. For example, the law of non-contradiction is inherent in truth. To say that I parked a blue car outside of my home when in fact it was a red car, it would be untrue of me. And so the statement would be an exclusive statement. It's a truth claim.
Mm.
And so understanding this in a broad perspective, one that goes necessarily kind of beyond the framework of just a worldview, just a factual understanding of what truth is. I think this is a healthy starting point for anyone, if not everyone, to really begin to start this question of exclusivity. And I believe we can go from there, I think.
Mm. Yeah,
Better.
definitely. So you mentioned something interesting. What do you think, Jonathan, it happens when a person says, I actually don't have a worldview? Does that imply that he or she has one without recognizing that he or she has it?
Yeah, I would say yes. Perhaps the worldview would include the thought that they do not believe that they have a worldview, but it would in and of itself still yet be a worldview, for they would
Yeah.
see the lens through which they see things as them not having a worldview.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so then now that we have talked and defined a worldview and what it does and the lenses through which we see the world, that's a beautiful way to put it. Then what happens with Christianity? And I would say, to be more precise, what happens with Jesus, who is more important than what happens around him. So he says that he is God, and then he also says that he's the only way to get to heaven, or so
Mhm.
what can what do you think about that statement first? How have you dealt with this statement as you learned more about him as a Christian?
I actually started from the starting point thinking that I believe, like many others, is this really is he really the only way?
Mm,
And I began there, although that I grew up in a home and in a church, very constantly reading scripture and being told time and time again this claim, but I really began to think about it, and I came to the conclusion that this would only be a problem if it wasn't true. If it was a lie that Jesus wasn't the only way, then it would be wrong. But if it was true, whether or not I liked it or not, that's something different. But if it was true, then it wasn't wrong.
mm-hmm,
And so I began with this question myself. seeking out Jesus and Christ, and I began to, in a way, kind of put him to the test. Is he really who he says he is? You know, is he really sinless? Is he really perfect? Did he really live this pure life?
Mm,
Is he truly God? I began myself to put him to the test, and I found, and I continue to find, and only continue to find more and more throughout life. He, what he said is true. That it isn't a feeling that I have that I just think or I like or I prefer, but with a test of logic, with a test of a way to measure and verify his claims,
mhm,
with with the with the life that I've lived and the sense that it makes coherently and how it all corresponds, I have found that this claim that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way unto God to be true. And I think that perhaps it may at first sound as the narrow road is unkind, but I believe that when we begin to understand better and look into the claim, and not just the claim in and of itself, but the person of Jesus, we find that it's with love, it is with grace and mercy, kindness and forgiveness that he makes this claim. And it's not one that is so negatively authoritarian
mhm,
as if he is demanding out of fear from us just absolute obedience. But with love, he gives the freedom to choose because along with his claim, along with his identity as God, the only way, the truth, and the life, he does so as an offering to all. And I believe that this is the opposite of narrow, the invitation.
mm.
But as truth being exclusive, truth will be narrow, and anything that is untrue will not be allowed into this path. And I believe this is where we find Jesus.
Jonathan, I would like to hear your thoughts about this, but when having conversations about this particular topic, Jesus exclusivism or him being just the only way to get to heaven, or that he's the truth. Mm. Sometimes I first, but many people with me, we tend to forget that we are by nature exclusivists every day in our lives, and we just see Jesus as just the worst person in the world because he's saying that. But at the same time, we do that every day. So you mentioned a little bit, a few, you know we could say, ways that you actually dealt with this truth or biblical truth, which is, well, he's the truth, but how can I test this? You mentioned logic, you mentioned, I think indirectly, experience, and you tested a little bit with history, the claim and what he did. Would you expand a little bit on that, so that people that are listening to this or watching this, they could say, okay, so perhaps I could learn how to do that on my own. What do you do in order to test this incredible claim from Jesus?
I think that the approach must be one with a genuine curiosity. I think it's important to say because, if one is approaching this to disprove, it may be approached differently than one to just approach the question out of curiosity and for a genuine answer. Perhaps it is not so difficult at times to find and understand the truth. Oftentimes, it may be more difficult to accept it. It may be so difficult that it's uncomfortable, and so we may choose to not accept the truth.
Mm,
Uh, and so I'd like to say just that. But in how we can test, um, and not just that it requires so many tests, but in testing the claim of Christ, logically, you can put him to the test. He says something. Okay, does it make sense? Does it make sense? His claims about the condition of man, of
Mm,
humankind.
mhm,
Uh, I find this in the affirmative, that yes, it does. He doesn't paint a picture that is perhaps of the hopeful necessarily, but he
mm,
gives hope where there is a darkness, and he is honest about the claim of how, in scripture, how, evil comes out of the heart. It's not necessarily just this idea, but out of man comes these evil actions and thoughts. And with this, we find that there's a malady, there's an illness, there's something wrong.
mm,
And he doesn't stop there. He then offers a remedy, and the remedy is himself. And this self is needed, the birth, the life lived, the death and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ, each is needed. And in doing so, living this perfect human, or this perfect life in human form, but also as God, 100% man, 100% God, Christ is able to pay the payment
mm,
that is required for the violation of our purpose.
mm,
And the violation of our purpose, in other words, is sin, and it's sin against God. And Jesus is the sacrifice on the cross. And in this, he offers salvation. He offers forgiveness in love. And this is tested in terms of, say, the more viable historicity. You know, Jewish and Christian historians would, of course, offer that there is evidence that Christ was physically crucified, but
mm,
so did Greek and Roman and even pagan scholars in their history offer that with evidence it is proven that Christ was crucified.
mhm.
Now, some would disagree about the resurrection of Christ, and that's fair. But and with both research in a secular sense and a biblical sense, we find these claims to be true. Now,
Mm.
whether or not we believe them, again, it's a choice. But there are many different ways to approach them. Perhaps the approach some may more commonly find today is perhaps of the physical evidence, and that, of course, would make very much sense.
Mm,
But even in verifying the very scriptures themselves, the manuscripts themselves, the historicity of them, the reliability of them, the consistency of them, standing the test of time, more than 2,000 years, and being affirmed, used, verified daily by both believers and non-believers, Christians and non-Christians. It goes to provide evidence. And what I would very quickly say is that there isn't perhaps this claim from a Christian with such boastfulness in themselves, but rather in the claim that God himself makes, not that just a person, a man, myself makes, but that God himself makes.
mm,
And
mm.
I believe that as we continue to, or begin to, seek these questions, and what we find would surmise to be that Christ is who he says he is.
So, what happens, Jonathan, when having conversations with our non-Christian friends, and we hear, or atheist thinkers, secular thinkers, and for example, something that people share about this question usually is, you're saying that Jesus is the only way to go to heaven or to be saved, or there are many ways to express this from the biblical and non-biblical perspective. But they go, well, that's very narrow-minded. Why your religion and not the other 4,200? I think that's the number that where we are. So around, of course. So why you? Why? How can you make a claim like that? That sounds very narrow-minded.
I've heard it said once that it would be perhaps like answering why we must all believe in gravity and its law of gravity, and not just think that I can create my own law of gravity.
Hmm.
And the reason that is because in the claim being exclusive, in other words, narrow, it is perhaps not narrow-minded, but the claim offers an exclusivity in its very nature. Again, being truth by definition is exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
I, I've heard it also said, it's a fair question, perhaps, well, you don't possibly have all of the time in your lifetime to study every religion. How could you possibly know your religion is right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've studied, and I'm sure if anybody's listening and they hear what I'm saying, they may find that what I'm saying is perhaps familiar to them. I've studied many years, many different um, believers, not arguments per se, but their studies, their findings, their lives, in terms of their faith. And one individual in particular that I admire very much, and I mourn his loss most recently, Ravi Zacharias.
Mm-hmm.
I've listened to many of his discussions, but in studying what he uses to go about a framework to answer this question, it's been helpful for me to answer, and so I'll use it. But in testing truth, we find that there must be a correspondence and a coherence.
Mm-hmm.
It must cohere together. All the bits of pieces of the worldview must fit together. Many people may believe that, if they have the finger and the thumb, they have everything, but they don't have the whole hand. And so they may believe that they're onto something, but they must have it all in its full coherence, and it must be cohesive. It must come all together and make sense. So truth must pass this correspondence theory and this coherence theory, and we can test it with logic. Uh, does it make sense? Is it verifiable? Empirical adequacy, number two. And the third is experiential relevancy. Is, how does this meet me in reality? How does this actually take place and affect me in real life?
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth is, each worldview answers four major questions: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where do we come from? What is our purpose? Why are we here? How do I differentiate between right and wrong, good and evil? And destiny, what happens in the end? Is this just it, or is there something later?
Mm-hmm.
And the question of who is God is really perhaps the most important question we can answer, because our one answer to this one question will determine how we answer everything else in life. It will determine what we value. It will determine what we do, what we decide not to do.
Mm-hmm.
It will determine everything else. And so with this framework, I believe that, as you begin to test, say, other worldviews, uh, you can really go down a long list. But if you test Christianity, if you test the claims of Christ, you find that, to repeat myself, you find Christ's claim, as we've begun with. Jesus Christ says in John chapter 14, verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes into the Father except through me." And he's speaking to Thomas in this moment. And Thomas himself, sometimes is called the doubter. And Christ is crucified, and he's in the tomb, and someone makes the claim, and Christ is risen. And Thomas himself says, "I will not believe until my eyes have seen." And so in the word, it says, Christ appears to him, and Thomas sees him and believes. But Thomas himself, one who is with him for years and studies with him, he himself doubted. He himself had questions, and in this moment didn't believe. And so I would say that, perhaps as we study the exclusive claims that Christ makes, as we test it out, we find that whether one may like Christ or one may not like Christ. And if I may quickly say, Mahatma Gandhi, who was not a Christian, when he was alive, he made a statement that I find so fascinating. He says, in terms of Christianity, he said, "I like their Christ. I don't like their Christian." And I think it's fair. I think it's
Mm.
fair. And so with that, what I mean by that, and to bring it up, is that you don't study and make judgment of a worldview by its wrongs, by its mistakes, by its errors, by its abuses. You study it in its purest of forms, and what it truly intends to be, what it truly is. This is what you test.
Mm.
Because what we will find is that, say, the practitioners of a worldview or a faith, Christians included, myself very much included, we will find error. But in the claims that Christ himself makes, in the claims that Scripture makes, I would I would fairly posit an offering to anyone that if they study with a genuine curiosity and they put to the test the claims, they will find that it passes the tests of coherence and correspondence. There's a logical outworking to it. It has empirical evidence and adequacy, and it actually has relationship with us.
Mm.
And in this, we find that, and I perhaps can note now that, the question really is, what do you say to someone who says, well, that's just so narrow? I don't think perhaps it's so narrow as it's so inviting, that there is even a way, that there's even a possibility, that
Mhm.
there's even an offering, an extension, salvation, because that's hope, that's love offered, and to be given that to begin with is a blessing in the first place. And that, I don't think, is so narrow but so kind.
Mm.
uh, but perhaps many others may not see it as such, but I would understand.
Yeah. You know, one of the that quotes that you shared with me, I think it was, I'm not sure about it. So you who are watching, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I
Mhm.
think it was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. He said the first and last Christian died on a cross. I think it was him. He was an atheist.
Yeah.
Um, that's interesting. And then the the terminology, or talking about exclusivism and all of this, it was hard for me when I was an atheist and I was learning about Christ and other religions. And definitely that statement in John 14:6, we've talked about this already. It's a hard statement. But then I didn't realize about this right at the moment that I was exploring it. But then later, when I was pondering and reflecting upon this idea, I said, when I go to the supermarket and I want to buy, let's say, tomato sauce,
Mhm.
if if I buy one brand and I say this tomato sauce is the best tomato sauce in the world, it is definitely true that I haven't tried all the tomato sauce that there exists
Yeah.
in on Earth. But that's fine. But this is just an example that, of course, if this is a trivial example, but when it comes to deciding where we're going to go after we die, or the importance of our living, making a choice, we make choice about everything, even with, let's say, with politics. When a person goes and votes for a particular political party, what that vote is saying is, I would like this country to be run this way. I mean, that is very exclusive. We do it every day. But I've always found very interesting, Jonathan, when it comes to the big questions in life, like, we should be actually worried about those, because we
Yeah.
know that we're going to die, right? We're going to die.
Yeah.
So when it comes to this, when we find exclusive terms in with respect to religion and big questions in life, it seems more insulting, let's put it that way, than when it comes to all the decisions that we make around us. So I found that always very difficult to understand. There's something I wanted to ask you about too, Jonathan. Um, Exclusivism is a term that is thrown out a lot when it comes to talk about this. Also, um, you know, people say, this is, if you're saying this, that you're saying that truth is absolute. And what about other people all around the world? They have their own truths, you know?
Mm.
So there cannot be only one truth. What are you saying? I mean, you don't know. I mean, we're talking a little bit about the same, but I'm throwing these new terms so that people and me learn it better, which
Mm.
is relativism. And this is something that I think we're going through something like that today. So, everything is relative. There's no absolute truth. Would you expand a little bit about relativism and how the idea of Jesus Christ saying what he says relates to it?
I think that's a great question. And I agree with you. I think that is a very popular, not just thought, but conversation that's going on
Mm-hmm.
currently, has been, and I think will continue to. Um, you know, what you just said, people claiming that there is no absolute truth, that in and of itself is a truth claim. And so, in the very nature of the statement, it 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 assumes that there is absolute truth, so that the claim that they make that there's no such thing as absolute truth is true. And so I think
Yeah.
one would be quick to, hopefully quick, to find that there is such thing as absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
That truth perhaps doesn't necessarily need absolute in front of it. That truth itself is absolute in its very nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in terms of relativism, you know, I found it funny one day. I was thinking, I work in construction, and very often we have to use drawings and plans. Not very often, I should say. All the time we use drawings and plans. And one in particular method in having a reference point, a control point in building, you must have a particular reference point.
Mm.
It cannot change. It cannot be altered. There is only one. And this this illustration, I began to think about, well, is that the same case with truth?
Mm.
Could I just move this idea of what is
That's
true
interesting.
around, and will it still guide me? Or in the illustration of building, will I still get a building that stands?
Mm.
The answer is no. And not just for the illustration's sake, but for understanding what truth is. I believe that when you can understand truth in its nature, you would find that relativism isn't necessarily allowed. It isn't necessarily allowed in the sense that perhaps it's an idea, but one that perhaps shouldn't be taken. And in particular, what I mean by that is, I value a person who offers the idea, but as much as I would love to take it, it in and of itself, the idea is not one that I believe should be taken. So, as much as I value a person and all people, if they told me I should go run in front of a car, it's relative, it won't hit you. Well, I would still be hit, and I surely would believe that it's relevant to me.
Mm.
And so, there is an absolute truth. Truth itself is absolute. And in making the claim there is no such thing as absolute truth, in and of itself, that is a truth claim.
Mm.
By definition, being exclusive truth claim.
So, Jonathan, why do you think people get annoyed when it comes to facing a potential truth at the worldview level? Why is that? What do you think?
It, that's a good question, because it's one that I think I would immediately answer, but I I realize that it's one that takes more seriousness than to just give it an answer.
Yes.
It's one that's personal.
Mm.
Each person has their own story. They have their own background. They're going through their own things, and they have certain experiences that, and throughout all of their life collectively, will offer a certain lens that they will view this idea, this reality of, well, one claims that this is true, but I don't like it. It's uncomfortable. I don't want it to be true. I don't accept this. This is not my truth. This over here on the other side, this feels good. I like this. This is true for me. It's not hurting me. It's not hurting someone else. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'm gonna go with this. I think that it's so many things. It really is multifaceted.
Mm,
But when someone becomes uncomfortable, annoyed, bothered, or even hurt by what they may hear, I think the feeling in and of itself is true. I I don't believe that someone is able to disregard or should disregard that what they feel is untrue or even necessarily wrong. But in approaching what the claim is, and maybe with some time, when someone is able to test it, when someone able is to when someone is able to look into it, that is the fair approach to
mm,
look into it. Because recently, a guy I know, he had an injury turn out to be something else, and much worse. And if he didn't look into it, although it's uncomfortable for him to go to the doctor, he doesn't like going to the doctor. It's an uncomfortable thing. He would wish it isn't true. He would just like to ignore it, which he did for some time, unfortunately. He finds that at some point it pains him so much that he can't ignore it. He can't just move on as if it's not there. And in perhaps a similar regard, not the same regard, but a similar one, when one decides a certain belief that they hold to be true, but yet isn't, at some point, I believe that it may hold them in a situation that is uncomfortable, but
mm,
that they cannot ignore,
mm,
and that although they may want to ignore, they may not or won't be able to.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm thinking about, as you're talking, I'm listening. Um, I'm thinking about all the conversations that I get to have with amazing friends and
Mhm,
non-believers. And this topic is, it seems at first blush, it seems to be like a very difficult topic.
mhm,
But when analyzing this topic at the level of experience and realizing that we are exclusive by nature in
mhm,
everything that we do, it starts to be seen with different eyes. You mentioned something before. You know, when someone says, "Well, you are a Christian, you follow Christ, but
mhm.
you haven't explored or studied the rest of religions that there exist in the world. So how can you know?" And how important it is to realize, that questions are definitely important, but the reason behind why that question is being asked is also very important. I realized that the same question could be asked to a non-believer. How do you know that that you are an atheist, for example, if you haven't explored either the 4,200 religions that there exist in the world? But there is something important, which is experience, and this is where I want to go now. Talking about theology, conceptual abstraction, and these incredible ideas that we talk about the end and heaven and sin. So, what about the experience? Let's keep testing this claim. If Jesus is the only way and the only truth and the life, how can we test that at the level of experience? How much does accepting that change one's life?
I think that when you look into the life of Jesus, it would be so interesting and very different if he never came down to earth.
Mm,
If he was never born, it would it would feel, I believe, perhaps unfair
mm,
that we would experience on earth the sufferings that we do, endure the pain that we would, and feel perhaps a bit betrayed or misunderstood if if God, who we would believe in this scenario, would say he loves us, but yet not experience that which we ourselves experience.
mm,
And when you look at Jesus, when in particular, when the two moments I think of, are when he goes into the wilderness and he goes up to the mountain and he's fasting for 40 days and he's tempted. It strikes me so that before, when I was much younger, I always thought that temptation itself was wrong,
Mm.
that I can't be tempted, that if I'm tempted, that's wrong to begin with. But
Yeah.
that's not the case. That's not the case. All of us are tempted. But what we find in reading what how Jesus responds is he doesn't respond how I would, especially not if I hadn't eaten. But he responds purely, and I can respect that. He goes through a trial, and the second thing I'll highlight is the cross of any and all trials. You know, if if God is who he says he is, and I believe he is who he says he is, and he has, omnipotence, and he's omnipresent, and he's all knowing, of all the ways to pick the way to live your life on earth, I would think that you wouldn't choose such a horrendous, excruciating death. I would think you'd pick something easy. I would think that you would really just make everything easy. You'd be rich down here, you'd have the highest status, reputation, no problems, but he doesn't do that. And I believe that out of love, he and justly so, he comes to earth. He's born into not very much. He lives a very normal life. I'd be very curious to know what he did the many other years of his life that we
Yeah.
don't know exactly that he did what he did. But in the final few years that he lives in such a way that's unlike any other person, perfectly spotless, blameless. And in his death, as he's hanging on the cross, he says, God forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. I wouldn't respond to my enemies with
Mm.
love. I wouldn't respond that way. And I say I because in experiential relevancy, I think it's a wonderful question. It really is. What does this mean for me? Okay, hey, great. That's great. He did all this. He is who he says he is. But what does it mean for me? I just live in Nashville, Tennessee. What if somebody lived in, Cambodia? What does it do for them? It, he offers us a a humility that we can look to him and we can know he lived life, and in his death, the love and forgiveness that he offers is so giving. It's unlike I've ever experienced myself from anyone else. And this, I think, it's so important. I don't believe just for me, but for all believers, this love that is unlike any other that we can and do experience.
Mm-hmm.
That and what I perhaps would underline it towards this end now, it's a relationship.
Mm.
It's not distant. God is called holy, and by definition, holy is defined as set apart. And I've heard it said before, Holy Father. Holy makes him so I could never attain him, but Father makes him so dear and near that once you're a child, you're always a child. Nothing can change that.
Mm.
And as Father, that relationship, son or daughter to him, it is so dear and near, so personal, so intimate, that this relationship itself is unique to Christ, unique to Christianity. And I know that in the recent questions, it's been framed, you know, is Christianity, why is Christianity so narrow-minded, so exclusive? But I would like to say, and not in a bashful manner, but in a fair one, that it isn't so much the question, is it so wrong that Christianity is just so exclusive? But if you do study and if you do look into other religions themselves are exclusive. The religion of Islam, the faith of Islam, who I will say, I very much respect the faith lived by Muslim brothers and sisters. The reverence that they have, that they have in their faith, the obedience that many of them have, the daily sacrifice that they partake in, all out of their faith, is very much something to respect. And I believe many Christians can learn from the way they practice their faith. And the same is to be said of of others, but the idea that it is Christianity that is just exclusive is one that I believe that is more popular, but
Yeah.
perhaps not as fair for others are also.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That was beautiful, Jonathan. Yes. And even the question itself, and of course I asked you because it's a very common question, but
Mhm.
when analyzing the question again, why is Christianity so narrow-minded or narrow-minded? The question, I mean, questions are good questions. We're
Mhm.
asking a question, but the question is actually confirming the fact that Christianity is narrow-minded. It's
Yeah.
before even just, okay, so is it possible that Christianity might be narrow-minded, or what do you think about this? Asking questions is very important. I do it all the time, and my nature as a human being, I don't know how to put it in a different way. I am a natural skeptic by heart,
Mm.
and I keep doubting, but I doubt towards faith. I
Yeah.
don't doubt away from faith. So I love, and something that happens to me, Jonathan, with respects to this question, when I have conversations with friends, family, non-Christians, friends as well.
Mhm.
What if, what if actually Christianity is false? Like, what if Christianity is false? And my mind goes directly to, how far can a lie go? For 2,000 years?
Yeah.
So that's the first, my mind goes there first. Second, how is it possible that a lie has even, uh, refrained, sorry, no, how do you say that? Reframe. Yes, that's the word. Like, it has reframed the way we understand and value our morals. Second,
Mhm.
how
Yeah.
is it possible that there are people that keep changing their lives from, let's say, any type of addiction, fear? They
Mhm.
change their lives and they become completely different men and women.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to deal with all that evidence, and this is not evidence that is conceptual evidence, or no, this is things, these are things that you see happening around you. So how far can a lie go? I always go to that question, and it's hard. It's very hard. One thing that also helps me too, when what happens to me, Jonathan, in my journey towards God, and of course specifically Jesus, was, there's something that Jesus does that is very special. The problem and the biggest fear in the world for everyone is death.
Mm.
I mean, that is, many people would say, well, I don't care if I die. Okay. But yeah, seriously, we all want to live, you
Yeah.
know? The
Yeah.
negation of living is, yeah, non-existence or dying or death, right? And then the same person that share the Sermon of the Mount with us,
Mhm.
the same person that lives the life that you have been talking about, is the same person in the same narratives, is the same person that resurrects and
Yeah.
ends the problem of death in the world. When you put all of this together, what do you do? Seriously. Like, I have always my skeptical heart. Sometimes I go, but what if this is not true? But it makes it even more difficult to go that route. What do you do with that? It's just very weird. Christianity is it's very strange, because this is not the type of philosophy that you would go, this is what I believe about the universe. And then you live your life in a different way, and philosophy and real life don't interact with each other.
Yeah.
No, Christianity is actually a philosophy of life that can be perfectly instantiated as
Mhm.
soon as you believe in it.
Yes.
It is a very strange is the word that comes to me, but it's truly something. It's very special. One thing I would like to ask you,
Mhm.
um, in somewhat related to the question, um, are we Christians, Jonathan? You and I, because we live in the United States. Now, there are many people that live in other countries and they don't get to hear the words of Christ, or they get to read the Bible. What do you think about this approach? Hey, you are a Christian, of course, because you were born in a culture. There were social pressures, cultures, traditions, religion was there already. My first thought is Christianity is not a Western religion. If we actually analyze it, it's actually a Middle Eastern one. I am
Yes.
from Spain. What's your country of origin?
I'm from Texas, but my parents are from Mexico.
Okay, so United States. I am from Spain,
Hmm.
and Jesus did his ministry for 3 years in Palestine.
Hmm.
So, in 2,000 years, you and I are having a conversation about this. Very interesting. What is your approach concerning this conversation?
I love what you just said.
Mm.
It encapsulates so much. It is strange what we believe. I mean, of I kind of think it's funny. We believe that Christ was born of a virgin birth,
Mm.
that he lived a perfect life, that he died, but that he rose from the dead. And not even that, and I missed so much in the middle, but that he performs all these miracles.
Yes.
He brings Lazarus back from the dead. He heals the paralytic, the blind, the deaf. He does all these things, and I believe all of it.
Mm.
And if I didn't, I I couldn't say that I knew Christ in the same way that I believe I ought to, because in his entirety, what he offers is everything.
Mm.
I can't pick and choose. But I mean, in regards to the idea of being born in a specific place, and being offered a particular worldview, a particular religious faith, or even affiliation, if you look at the entire world, I've only been fortunate enough, the privilege to visit three countries total. I've been to Mexico once to visit for a short, I think really just about a day, a short moment. And I've been to Haiti and to the Philippines, each only for a week. And I've met both Christians and non-Christians there. Even here, really in the United States, if the adage is true, we're just a melting pot of the many different people that we meet
Yes.
here.
Mm.
The many people who immigrate here, my family included. My family themselves were not always Christian. My
Mm.
grandfather was not always a Christian. And the idea that, just because you're born into a particular home or are affiliated with a particular worldview or faith, that you will automatically become that faith or believe that, I believe that's very quickly disproven merely in looking at maybe just one street of your own home where you live. Not everyone will believe what their parents believed. Not everyone will believe what their brothers or sisters believe.
Mm.
And the idea that, it is just where you grow up, I don't think that's perhaps uh, all true. Um, Absolutely, it is very important. It is of course very critical in how things turn out, what you do believe and what you maybe don't believe. That of course is true, but it isn't everything. Many people, in particular in the Middle East, they don't just claim, but they adamantly share dreams that they have of being Muslims and being Muslims for all of their lives, and one day having a dream or having multiple dreams of a vision, and later coming to become a Christian. And
Mm.
for anyone who is familiar with, or they themselves are uh, of the Islam faith, of a Muslim, there's so much sacrifice to just one day no longer be a Muslim. There's so much sacrifice, so much to be given up, and to decide of all things to what to believe, to decide to believe that Christ did die on the cross, that he did raise from the dead, and have faith in him from the background of an Islamic faith. That is tremendous, and
Mm.
that is happening every day. And I think that's amazing. But what we believe, I surely do agree, it is strange.
Yes, yes. It is. It is strange. Yeah, definitely. Well, Jonathan, this has been fascinating. I'm very thankful for you. It has been a very calm and insightful conversation. I only have one more question for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Then, would you share with us your final thoughts concerning this question? I mean, you have shared a lot about this and very, very insightful, as I said. But a person, let's say, a person that is exploring the Bible for the first time, and
Mm.
is reading John, and all of a sudden, a new, just a young person, let's say, we could say, growing up in a culture where the internet has brought us together, in between quotations, digitally. We keep track of everything that is going on. We're more aware of the existence of many cultures and ways of thinking, all of this. And all of a sudden, boom, you go to the statement, I'm real, I'm here, I live, and I'm actually the only way for you to be who you want to be. To find identity, you're going to find it in me. Would you share with us your final thoughts? And what would you say, or how would you approach that conversation with this person?
I love the question because I believe that every one of us is living out our response to this question every day.
Hmm.
We really are. I do believe that. But to one who is curious and they are seeking many different religions, many different worldviews, if they are to come across the Bible, if they are to come across uh, the scriptures, I would offer them to read it,
Hmm.
to really read it. Um, it's not so daunting. It is just letters and words put together, but it isn't just that. It's alive. The word says that it is living, and I believe that one would find that as they would read the life of Jesus, the whole narrative from cover to cover, from Genesis to Revelation, they would find that there's a plethora of literature types. There are poems, there are psalms, there are letters, there are writings of history. There are so many different types. It in and of itself, by itself, is interesting, but when they encounter Jesus, I would hope that they would, and they would find that it would change their life, I
Hmm.
believe.
Hmm.
And if it doesn't, that that isn't wrong. That isn't a mistake. But I think that if their curiosity is there, I would offer the kind invitation to read and see for themselves, to find it, and if anything does seem off, to ask the question. They don't have to be in isolation, and perhaps not even in the internet world, but perhaps seeking out someone in person.
Hmm.
Perhaps they go to a local church. Perhaps they visit a friend who is a believer. But in doing so with others, I think that it would be beautiful to see them not do it in isolation. It would be a wonderful thing to see them do it with others.
Hmm.
And with others in community, I would find that with that curiosity, it can take them very far.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for being with me in the show today. I really, really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for listening so much to me. Thank you so much for
Yes,
having
and thank you very much for everyone that is watching or listening. And as you know, if you would like to contact with me and ask me questions, or even challenging today's ideas, you're more welcome to do so. And you can do it by sending an email at askandwondernashville@gmail.com, or you can go directly to the website and go through the contacts page. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Thank you, Jonathan. And
Thank
I'll
you.
see you guys next time.